Welcome to the Tailings Podcast, where we explore all things tailings management and geotechnical engineering. It's a vision brought to life by our founder, Mohammed Sabi. Mohammed prefers to work behind the scenes, but his commitment to knowledge sharing and inspiring innovation drives every conversation we have here. Today, we're going to be diving deep into a major development that could really change how we approach tailings safety worldwide, and that is the Global Tailings Management Institute.
It's a mouthful, I know. But trust me, it's big.
Okay, so break it down for us. What is the GTMI and why should we care?
Well, picture this. It's 2019, and the world is still reeling from that awful Brumadinho Dam collapse in Brazil. 272 lives lost, a community shattered, and a really harsh reminder of the risks that come with tailings dams. This tragedy sparked a global outcry for change, which ultimately led to the development of the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management, the GSTM for short. But standards are only as good as their implementation, right?
Exactly. Having guidelines on paper is one thing, but how do you actually make sure they're being followed, especially in an industry as complex and global as mining?
That's where the GTMI comes in. Think of it as the muscle behind the GSTM, making sure those standards don't just sit on a shelf.
So how do they plan on doing that? Are we talking like a global team of tailings inspectors flying around the world with clipboards?
Not quite, although that would be a sight. Their main function is to manage what we call an assurance framework for the GSTM. It's like a system of checks and balances that makes sure mining companies are actually doing what they're supposed to when it comes to safety.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does this assurance framework actually involve?
Well, there are a few key components. First, they'll be promoting the GSTM and encouraging adoption worldwide. They'll also be sharing best practices and giving guidance to mining companies on how to implement the standard effectively. But the real teeth of the framework is the oversight of independent audits and certifications of tailings facilities.
So like a restaurant health inspection, but for tailings dams.
Exactly. These independent auditors will be like the Gordon Ramsays of tailings management, coming in and scrutinizing everything from the design and construction of the dam to its maintenance records and emergency response plans. And here's the kicker. They'll be issuing a public report on their findings.
What, public? So anyone could potentially see how a particular mining company is managing its tailings dams.
That's the idea. This transparency is a game changer. It means communities living near these facilities, investors putting money into mining operations. Really, anyone concerned about tailings safety will have access to independently verified information on how these facilities are being managed.
Wow, that's a level of transparency we haven't really seen before in the mining industry.
It is, and it's a direct response to the calls for greater accountability that we saw after tragedies like Brumadinho. Mining companies can't operate in a black box anymore when it comes to tailings safety.
This is fascinating. But before we get too deep into the weeds of how this all works, I think it's important to understand who's actually behind the GTMI. It's not just some industry-led group, right?
You're right. One of the most unique things about the GTMI is its multi-stakeholder governance structure. The board isn't just made up of mining executives. They've got representatives from communities, indigenous peoples, investors, environmental experts, even members of the mining workforce.
That's interesting. How will they make sure all these different voices are actually heard and taken seriously in the decision-making process? I mean, these are groups that often have very different interests and perspectives when it comes to mining.
It's a challenge for sure, but the GTMI is committed to creating a space where these diverse perspectives can be brought to the table and actually considered. They realize that to truly achieve zero harm from tailings dams, they need buy-in from all stakeholders.
It's a bold ambition. I'm curious to learn more about how they plan to get mining companies on board with this level of scrutiny and transparency. I mean, what's the incentive for a company to voluntarily open themselves up to this kind of independent audit?
That's a great question, and one we'll definitely delve into further. But I can tell you this. The GTMI isn't just about compliance and risk avoidance. It's about recognizing that responsible tailings management can actually be a competitive advantage.
Now, that's an angle I didn't expect.
Okay.
I'm definitely hooked.
Good. Because in part 2, we're going to be exploring the potential benefits for mining companies that choose to embrace the GTMI framework.
Can't wait. But for now, we're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Tailings Podcast. We're talking about the Global Tailings Management Institute and its mission to kind of revolutionize tailings safety. Now, before the break, you were about to explain how joining the GTMI could actually be a smart move for mining companies. It sounds counterintuitive, to be honest.
I get that. On the surface, it does seem like more scrutiny and public audits would just be a headache for a company. But if you look a little deeper, there are some really good reasons why becoming a GTMI signatory could make a company more competitive.
Okay, convince me. What are these hidden benefits?
Well, think about reputation for one. These days, investors and consumers are really focused on environmental and social responsibility. So showing that you're committed to top-notch tailings management can really set you apart.
So like a badge of honor, showing that you take safety seriously.
Exactly. A company that has that GTMI certification and a clean audit record, they're sending a strong signal to investors, customers, communities that they're a responsible operator.
Makes sense. And I imagine that could lead to some actual benefits, like attracting more investment or getting better insurance rates.
Absolutely. Investors are looking for companies that are managing ESG risks effectively. And tailing safety is a big one. A GTMI signatory is probably going to be seen as a lower risk investment, and that could mean lower borrowing costs and easier access to capital.
What about insurance? Could joining the GTMI actually make it easier for a company to get insurance for their tailings dams?
It's definitely possible. Insurance companies are paying close attention to tailings management practices these days, and having that independent assurance framework like the one the GTMI provides, well, it could give insurers more confidence in a company's risk management, which could lead to better coverage and lower premiums.
So it's like a win-win. Mining companies improve their reputation, attract investors, maybe save on insurance,
And
and, oh yeah, help prevent catastrophic tailings dam failures.
exactly. It's a shift in mindset. We're moving away from just thinking about safety as a cost and starting to see it as a vital part of a company's long-term sustainability and success.
But let's be real for a second. The mining industry has a long history, and not all of it's good. We've seen companies put profits over safety time and time again. What makes us think this time will be different? What's to stop a company from cutting corners or trying to influence those independent audits?
That's a valid concern. But the GTMI has safeguards to make sure the assurance framework stays strong. The independent auditors are chosen very carefully and have to follow a strict code of ethics.
Okay, so the auditors are impartial. But what about the companies? What's to stop them from trying to cheat the system?
The GTMI has thought about that too. The framework allows for whistleblowing and has grievance mechanisms, so anyone who sees something wrong can report it confidentially.
So it's not just hoping the companies will do the right thing. There are ways to hold them accountable.
Right, and remember that transparency piece we talked about? The fact that those audit reports will be public, well, that creates another big incentive for companies to act responsibly. They know that any attempts to cut corners or hide something could end up hurting them way more in the long run.
I see how all these pieces fit together to encourage real change. But ultimately, the GTMI success depends on something bigger than just rules and regulations, doesn't it?
You're absolutely right. It comes down to a culture shift within the mining industry. A realization that putting safety first isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do.
And that's where the GTMI's goal of zero harm really comes in. It's not just about reducing risk. It's about aiming to completely eliminate harm from tailings dams. That's a big statement.
It is. But it's a necessary one. Tragedies like Brumadinho have shown us that anything less just isn't acceptable. The GTMI is sending a message. The time for tolerating these risks is over.
So this isn't just another small step forward in tailings safety. This is like a whole new way of thinking, creating a future where tailings dams don't threaten people and the environment.
Exactly. And it's a vision that needs everyone to work together. Mining companies, communities, investors, regulators, everybody.
Okay, I'm convinced. The GTMI sounds like a really transformative initiative. But I'll admit, I'm still a little skeptical about how it'll all work in practice. We're talking about changing an entire industry's culture, not to mention all the technical challenges and political complexities.
I understand your skepticism. It's a huge undertaking, for sure. And there will be bumps along the way. But the fact that the GTMI even exists, it shows how powerful collective action can be. And that people are realizing that the old ways just aren't good enough anymore.
So where do we go from here? What are the next steps for the GTMI? And what can our listeners do if they want to get involved?
Those are great questions, and ones we'll be exploring in our final segment.
Stay with us. Welcome back to the Tailings Podcast. We've been having a fascinating conversation about the Global Tailings Management Institute, the GTMI, and their goal of achieving zero harm from tailings dams. It's a bold vision, and I'm curious to hear more about how they plan to actually make it happen.
Well, the first step is getting mining companies to sign on to that GTMI framework and commit to implementing the global industry standard on tailings management.
Right, the GISTM, we've mentioned it a few times, but maybe a quick refresher for our listeners who aren't as familiar with it.
Of course. So the GSTM, it's basically a comprehensive set of guidelines for a responsible tailings management. It covers everything from dam design and construction to risk assessment and emergency preparedness. It's based on the best science and engineering practices out there. It reflects the collective knowledge of experts from all over the world.
So it's like the gold standard for tailings safety.
Exactly. And the GTMI's job is to make sure the GSTM doesn't just sit on a shelf gathering dust. They're the ones who will be overseeing those independent audits and certifications to verify that companies are actually putting those guidelines into practice.
Okay, so that's the carrot, the incentive for companies to join. But what about the stick? Are there any consequences for companies that choose not to participate?
Well, there aren't any direct penalties from the GTMI itself. It's not a regulatory body. But there could still be significant consequences for not joining.
Oh, so.
Well, think about it. In a world where investors and consumers are demanding responsible practices, a company that refuses to align itself with the global standard, they could really damage their reputation. They might find it harder to attract investment or get insurance, maybe even sell their products.
So the pressure to join comes from the market itself, not from regulations.
Right, and that's one of the things that makes the GTMI so unique. It's voluntary. But it could have huge implications for the industry. It's creating a whole new playing field where companies that prioritize safety and sustainability have a real edge.
It's a fascinating approach, but it also raises some questions. For instance, how will the GTMI make sure the GTM stays up to date? The mining industry is always changing, with new technologies and approaches coming out all the time.
That's a great point. The GTMI knows that the GTM isn't a static document. It has to constantly be reviewed and updated to keep up with the latest science and best practices.
So it's not a one-time thing, it's an ongoing process.
Exactly. The GTMI has a dedicated team that will be monitoring industry trends, conducting research, and talking to experts to make sure the GSTM stays relevant and effective.
That's good to hear. But let's be honest, we know that the mining industry often operates in some pretty tough places, countries with weak governance and maybe a history of corruption. So how can the GTMI make sure its standards are actually upheld in those contexts?
That's a valid concern, and one that the GTMI takes very seriously. They're working to build partnerships with governments, civil society organizations, local communities to promote transparency and accountability.
So it's not just about forcing standards from the outside, it's about working together to create a culture of safety from within.
Exactly. And the GTMI knows that achieving zero harm takes more than just technical solutions. It requires a fundamental shift in mindset, a commitment to ethical behavior across the board.
That's a powerful statement. And it reminds me of what you said before about the importance of changing the industry's culture. How does the GTMI actually plan to encourage that shift in thinking?
Well, one key strategy is education and training. They're developing resources and programs to help mining professionals at every level, to understand why responsible tailings management is so important, and to equip them with the skills to implement the GSTM properly.
So giving people the tools to become champions for safety.
Right. And the GTMI is also working with investors and financial institutions to encourage responsible investment, because they know that capital markets have a lot of influence on the mining industry.
It sounds like the GTMI is really tackling this from all sides.
They are, and while it's still early, I think the creation of the GTMI is a huge step forward for responsible tailings management.
I agree. It's a bold move.
Yeah.
And its success is really going to depend on everyone working together.
Absolutely. Mining companies, investors, governments, communities all have to do their part to really change the industry and create a future where tailings dams are no longer a threat.
It's well said. Now for our listeners who want to learn more about the GTMI or get involved, where should they go?
The GTMI website is a great place to start. It's www.thegtmi.org. You can find tons of information about the GASTM, the assurance framework, and the Institute's various initiatives. They also have information on how to support them or get involved in their training programs.
So if you want to be part of the solution, head over to their website. The GTMI is a new chapter for tailings management, and your involvement could help make a difference. This has been a truly insightful look into the world of tailings safety and the launch of the GTMI. Thanks for joining us on the Tailings Podcast.